It's time for yet another request review. This time this request is from GM Command over on Patreon, requesting for me to review the 13-episode anime series Serial Experiments Lain. And you know what? This makes the 4th anime review in a row that came directly from Tech TV, which sort of makes me think, you know, it's just so weird. It's almost like GM Command and those 3 other guys before him were all really big fans of Tech TV! Serial Experiments Lain, the anime series, released in 1998, just a little ahead of its PlayStation visual novel game that was intended to be released first. Compile that with a single chapter of a manga that was released a little after that, and the overarching story and idea behind Lain is a strange, somewhat confusing, and yet important piece of fandom history. Those who have watched previous reviews of mine might recognize the character designs as being similar to those from Haibane Renmei, as the characters in both series were designed by Yoshitoshi Abe. The director of the anime, Ryutaro Nakamura, directed other such things as Sakura Wars, a huge favorite game series of mine, and Kino's Journey. The producer, Yasuyuki Ueda, also produced Haibane Renmei and tons of other titles like Hellsing and Hellsing Ultimate. His name is going to be important later, but let's come back to him in a bit. Serial Experiments Lain is such a strange title that it is kind of difficult to describe the plot, although it's not impossible. Over the course of 13 episodes, we follow the life of Lain, a middle school girl who's a little quiet and awkward with only a loose group of friends at school. One day, her dad gives her a top-of-the-line PC, called a Navi in this universe, and slowly, as time goes on, we appear to see Lain lose herself into an internet-like network colloquially called the Wired. It soon becomes difficult to tell where reality ends and where the Wired begins, and Lain eventually can't seem to keep track of what her internet persona is doing when her physical body isn't interacting with the Wired. Who is Lain, really? Is she a denizen of this world, or does she actually belong in the Wired? And why do people keep saying they see her in places doing things she doesn't remember doing? Why is she so special? Why are there dudes in suits following her every movement? Also, where did Lain get all this extra technology after her dad initially bought her that computer? The series never explains that, but in the grand scheme of things, it's surely the least confusing part of the whole thing. The audio and visuals are incredibly disjointed, and being able to identify what the narrative is doing and where it's going becomes particularly difficult, although that's definitely there by design. It's clear the creators absolutely intended to begin to blur the line between reality and the internet so that you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. While being an early idea of what the internet could really become one day, with computers based on iMac designs and high-tech PDA devices that worked separately from cell phones, and while some of these things truly did not age very well into the year 2016, some internet behaviors depicted in the series didn't change much over time. The spreading of information and misinformation, copycats and identity thieves, and large anonymous groups trying to hack, crack, and widely spread information for their own sense of right and justice, these are things that humans will always try to do if technology is left up to them. And in a way, Serial Experiments Lain looks like something of a cautionary tale, both of allowing humanity to be so deeply and dangerously networked, as well as warning the viewer to perhaps not get so deeply lost within a virtual space that you can no longer tell the difference between a virtual world and reality. In some ways, I felt like the way this idea was presented to its audience was somewhat pretentious. As if the series Serial Experiments Lain thinks it's way smarter than it actually is.
このリアルワールドに神という存在は概念でしか存在しない。しかし、ワイヤードならゼウス的存在が具現しうるのではないか。
And the studios apparently took the project on, knowing that this series was so far off the usual beaten path for televised anime at the time that it was considered a huge risk. However, despite all of those things, I absolutely believe that the series holds merit, although maybe not in the ways one might initially think. This series is all about perspective in quite a lot of ways. Not only do I refer to one's perspective on the positive or negative influence of technology and the internet, but also about one's perspective as a resident of either the Eastern or the Western world. Specifically, I cite Japan's relationship with America. It had been largely noted that Serial Experiments Lain had apparently been holding some anti-American sentiment somewhere within it. When the series was originally dubbed by Geneon, the word was spread that anything anti-American was purposely not recorded into the dub. Interviews with producer Yasuyuki Ueda insinuated that he was hoping for a clash of cultures and a war of ideas between Americans and Japanese. In an interview with AntiAmerican in October 1999, Ueda states, "American viewers won't understand this. I don't want them to understand this. This work is based on the sensitivity and values of the Japanese people. America is different from Japan. The work itself is sort of a cultural war against American culture and the American sense of values we adopted after World War II. So I want American people to react to this work." Well, that seems really damning. So having always been told for more than a decade that our translations left out the anti-American sentiment, for the sake of this review, I watched the series with subtitles and hoped that my Japanese was good enough that I'd be able to pick up on any translation I didn't entirely agree with. Well, aside from some stylistic choices, I really didn't find anything especially disturbing in the subs. What I did find, however, is that this anti-American sentiment isn't really something that can be directly translated into words. There is no direct, overt vocabulary that suggests a hatred for America. Instead, what can be found are little elements of things that wouldn't even hit your brain unless you were living in Japanese society, having grown up indoctrinated with certain images and stories about your country's past with America. I say indoctrinated because Japan is indoctrinated in one way, exactly the same as America is indoctrinated in another way. Now, this isn't exactly a direction I thought I would be taking this review in, but maybe by talking about this, it can make you think about a few things if this is something you've never really thought about before. There's one episode in particular of Lain in which a strange narrator who's never appeared before begins talking about the early beginnings of modern technology. The whole thing involves Americans and America's progress in technology.
コンピューターが登場する以前に、ブッシュは原爆実験マンハッタンプロジェクトの指揮をすると同時に、現在のマルチメディアの基礎を生み出していたのだった。
From Roswell, to the Manhattan Project, to the invention of hypertext, the list goes on. And it totally makes sense that Japan would have especially strong feelings about the Manhattan Project. After all, through America's nuclear science, we created weapons of mass destruction that killed entire populations of innocent civilians in 2 Japanese cities. Maybe it was the right thing to do to end war, and maybe it wasn't. Ultimately, as a human being, I'm saddened that innocent people had to die to end war, and I wasn't even there. While I can empathize with Japan, I cannot possibly fathom the depths of the scars left on their society for the better part of a century afterward. And of course, America then came along and wrote up Japan's constitution, making their society function largely like our own. With that comes resentment from many people in Japan, especially an older generation that lived through it, or their children who were raised by the people who lived through it. Ueda's definitely not the only anime creator who has ever created art about this or publicly spoken up about this sentiment. Even world-renowned Studio Ghibli animator Hayao Miyazaki has been particularly outspoken about his resentment of the Americanization of Japan. So is this the way all Japanese people feel and they just don't want to tell us? Well, that might be true of an older generation, but not so much now. Even Lain's Ueda states in other interviews that younger generations don't care. They don't see or feel the burden. This is just the way their world is now. Ueda seems to have embraced anime, manga, and video games, though he grew up with grandparents that were killed in our World War II bombings and parents that told him he couldn't play video games or read manga. So maybe he's happier now than he was during Lain's creation in 1998. But how should Americans interpret the series? Well, Well, according to Ueda, he was hoping that this was going to create a war of ideas, that it'd open up dialogue between Americans and Japanese, that we could learn to become closer this way. But did America's reaction to Lain do this? Apparently not. At Otakon 2000, Ueda told Anime Jump, "I'm glad that everyone likes Lain. But at the same time, I kind of wonder, do people over here really understand Lain? The way I perceive things, the way Japanese viewers perceived Lain would be different from how Americans viewed it. But when I was in LA, the fans I met seemed so very Japanese in their perception. And that kind of isn't what I wanted, because like I said earlier, I wanted there to be a clash between cultures. I wanted American fans to see Lain and think, no, that's screwed up, that's so wrong. So Americans got the Japanese perspective then? Perhaps that all this buildup of technology leads to people losing their identity between the internet and the real world? I'm not sure if Ueda was expecting that we would see Lain and think, nah, our technology is okay, and even if we lose ourselves, so what? I think most people, regardless of the culture you were raised in, are able to distinguish the difference between a fictional world and reality unless there's something seriously wrong with the individual to begin with. Or did Ueda run into fans that understood that what our culture did to another one was indeed messed up, and we all acknowledged it, and he didn't expect us to do that? Well, if what he wanted was a discussion, I think I'm giving him that, though it comes from the study of cultures and of his words, not necessarily of Lain. A resentment of American culture is to be expected, I think, from a certain demographic. But expecting us to not understand the damage that being too connected to a worldwide network and not being able to distinguish ourselves from our digital personas isn't necessarily something you can pin on being American. I don't know that I would consider it xenophobic thinking, but perhaps it is a little prejudiced? My language here probably insinuates that I'm more upset than I actually am, and I hope that I'm able to articulate to my audience that I can see how someone would have come to these conclusions about the large differences in our culture, and about how painful it is to think that your entire society's culture is being overwritten. In a chat with the Anime Colony in August 2000, Uedo and Abe both talk about how nobody in their generation hasn't been influenced by American culture in some way. I mean, think about it. America's largest export is easily entertainment. Our movies, books, TV, and games are known the world over. That's easily seen within the confines of Serial Experiments Lain, and the creators themselves acknowledge that this is why the title of the series and each episode is in English, and why there's such an abundance of English throughout it. But aside from that, a thought that technology could one day override what's good for the Earth is a constant concern for everyone, Americans included. So perhaps a fear of American culture is slightly misplaced, at least maybe in this particular example. But don't get me wrong, there's plenty of reasons to fear America and our manifest destiny mentality, but that could get me going down a completely separate rabbit hole. To round out talking about the series, however, the animation is limited and repeating in many places, probably to further influence the sense of losing one's grip on reality, and the music at times can be unsettling. The opening theme, Duvet, as performed by Jasmine Rogers and the band Boa, is also somewhat haunting and gives a sense of someone losing themselves. I think it's also important to briefly talk about that PlayStation game, also, which is something of a psychological horror presented in a strangely disjointed visual novel setting. While also presented in a jarring way that confuses the wired with reality, it tells a much more straightforward story about Lain ending up as a child of divorce, not knowing how to handle it, then attempting to sort of Frankenstein's monster up a version of her dad who left home, putting both his and her personality into the wired, and then it just gets weirder and more disturbing from there. Look up the cutscenes sometime, though I warn you, there are parts that can leave you feeling really uncomfortable afterward. There are parts of Serial Experiments Lain that I don't really think aged very well at all. And furthermore, I do still find parts of it to be pretentious. But at the same time, I think it's just well enough artfully done to be able to open up a dialogue of discussion about mankind's use of technology within the world, and then further knowing what the creators had in mind, it's that can then lead to discussions about bridging a gap between two societies that were once so dissimilar and have in some ways begun looking very much alike. Funimation acquired the license to Serial Experiments Lain a few years ago, so you can easily find it on DVD, on Funimation.com, or even through Funimation's official YouTube channel, completely free and legally. I enjoyed this intellectual look at Serial Experiments Lain, and I'm looking forward to doing another project with someone soon. Maybe it'll even be from you. Check out patreon.com/MarsGirl and see how you can get your own request review of a TV series, movie, or video game, or anything else. Thank you so much. I look forward to working with you soon.
Danny is a young sci-fi writer living in the UK. Everything was going great until one day he was captured by a beautiful woman, terrifyingly hot. Her name is Morphine. And she'll make you scream. Get ready for your adrenaline shot. 'Cause she locks him up in the basement. She tortures him day and night, whips and chains and moans and pain. She forces him to write amazing sci-fi stories and release them to the world. It's Danny, the writer boy, and Morphine is Mistress